Dr. Sarah Chen's hands trembled as she stared at the test results on her computer screen. After 15 years of studying criminal psychology, she had never seen anything like this. The numbers didn't lie, but they revealed a truth so terrifying that it made her question everything she thought she knew about human nature. Sarah had always been the skeptical type. Growing up in a family of doctors in San Francisco, she learned early that emotions could cloud judgment. So she built walls around her heart and buried herself in research. At 38, she was one of the youngest department heads at Stanford University's Psychology Research Institute. Known for her methodical approach to understanding the human mind, her colleagues respected her, but few truly knew her. Sarah preferred it that way. Personal connections meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant losing control. The morning had started like any other. Sarah arrived at her lab at 7 sharp, coffee in hand, ready to analyze data from her latest research project. For the past 3 years, she had been developing what she called the moral compass test, a revolutionary 3-minute psychological assessment designed to identify antisocial tendencies in seemingly normal individuals. The test combined rapid-fire ethical scenarios with biometric monitoring, measuring not just what people said they would do, but how their bodies actually responded to moral dilemmas. The idea had come to her after the Riverside Mall shooting 3 years ago. The perpetrator, Marcus Williams, had been a quiet college student with no criminal record, no history of violence, and no red flags that anyone could identify. He was, by all accounts, completely normal until the day he walked into a crowded shopping center and changed dozens of lives forever. Sarah became obsessed with one question. Could science have predicted his actions? She spent months designing the test, carefully crafting scenarios that would trigger specific psychological responses. The questions weren't obvious. Instead of asking, would you hurt someone? The test presented complex moral situations wrapped in everyday contexts. A participant might be asked to choose between saving a stranger's life or protecting their own reputation. Another scenario involved finding a wallet full of cash when they desperately needed money for rent. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that true antisocial individuals did unjust make different choices. Their bodies responded differently to moral stress, while normal people showed increased heart rate and skin conductance when contemplating harmful actions. Individuals with severe antisocial traits remained eerily calm. Their nervous systems barely registered activities that should trigger guilt, empathy, or moral conflict. Sarah had tested the system on over 2,000 volunteers, including convicted criminals, diagnosed psychopaths, and regular citizens. The results were staggering. The test accurately identified antisocial personalities with 93% accuracy, far exceeding any existing psychological assessment. Even more remarkable, it could detect these traits in people who had never committed crimes or shown obvious signs of antisocial behavior. But today was different. Today, Sarah was looking at results that challenged everything she understood about her own work.
The silence in her lab felt suffocating as Sarah stared at the screen. She had run the test on herself that morning, partly out of scientific curiosity, and partly to demonstrate its safety to her research committee. It was supposed to be routine, just another data point to add to her growing database. She expected to see the typical pattern of a well-adjusted individual, elevated stress responses during moral conflicts, clear emotional reactions to ethical dilemmas, all the markers of a functioning conscience. Instead, the results showed something that made her blood run cold. Her biometric data during the test looked almost identical to the convicted murderers in her database. When presented with scenarios involving harm to others, her heart rate remained steady, her skin conductance barely fluctuated, and her stress hormones stayed at baseline levels. According to her own research, these patterns indicated a severe lack of empathy and a dangerous disconnect from normal moral processing. Sarah ran the test 3 more times, convincing herself there must be a technical error. The equipment was functioning perfectly. The software was running exactly as programmed. Each time, the results were identical, painting a picture of someone who could contemplate violence without the biological safeguards that prevented most people from crossing that line. She thought about her childhood, searching for signs she might have missed. She remembered feeling detached during her grandfather's funeral, more curious about the family's grief reactions than experiencing sadness herself. In medical school, she had been the only student who could dissect cadavers without emotional distress, even finding the process intellectually fascinating. Her romantic relationships had always ended the same way, partners complaining that she seemed cold, calculating, unable to truly connect. Sarah had always attributed these traits to scientific objectivity and emotional intelligence. She prided herself on being rational, on making decisions based on logic rather than feelings. But now, staring at data that suggested she might be fundamentally different from the people around her, she wondered if what she had called strength might actually be something much darker. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years developing a test to identify hidden monsters in society, only to discover that she might be one of them. The woman who had dedicated her life to understanding evil had potentially been carrying it inside herself all along, hidden beneath layers of education, social conditioning, and professional achievement. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across her lab, Sarah faced a terrifying question. If her test was right, what did that make her? And more importantly, what was she capable of doing with this knowledge? The answer would come sooner than she expected, and it would change everything she thought she knew about the thin line between good and evil.
3 days passed before Sarah could bring herself to look at the test results again. She had spent those days going through the motions of her normal routine, teaching graduate seminars, attending faculty meetings, reviewing research proposals, while her mind raced with questions she didn't want to answer. Every interaction felt different now, as if she were observing herself from the outside, analyzing her own responses for signs of the darkness the test had supposedly revealed. The breaking point came during her Thursday evening seminar on criminal psychology. Sarah stood before a classroom of eager graduate students, discussing the neurological differences between psychopaths and typical individuals. As she explained how certain brain regions responsible for empathy and moral reasoning showed reduced activity in antisocial personalities, she caught herself wondering if her own brain looked similar under an MRI scanner. Dr. Chen interrupted Jessica Martinez, one of her most promising students. How can someone with these neurological differences function normally in society for years before anyone notices? Sarah paused, the question hitting uncomfortably close to home. That's the most dangerous aspect, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. High-functioning individuals with antisocial traits often excel at mimicking appropriate emotional responses. They learn to wear masks so convincing that even they might not realize what lies beneath. After class, Sarah found herself alone in her office, staring at a framed photo on her desk. It showed her receiving the Young Researcher Award 2 years ago, smiling confidently as the university president handed her the plaque. She remembered feeling proud that night, but as she examined her expression now, the smile seemed hollow, performed rather than genuine. How many of her emotions had been calculated responses rather than authentic feelings? The next morning, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for weeks to come. She needed to understand what her test results truly meant, and there was only one way to find out. She would put herself in situations that would normally trigger strong moral responses and observe her reactions. If she really lacked empathy and conscience, the evidence would reveal itself through her behavior. Her first opportunity came sooner than expected. Walking through the university parking lot after lunch, Sarah witnessed a hit-and-run accident. A delivery truck had sideswiped a parked Honda, leaving a significant dent and scrape along the driver's side. The truck driver looked around nervously, saw no witnesses except Sarah, and quickly drove away without leaving a note. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, watching the scene unfold. A normal person would feel compelled to help, either by confronting the driver or at least leaving their contact information for the car's owner. Instead, Sarah found herself analyzing the situation with clinical detachment. She noted the truck's license plate number, the extent of the damage, and the fact that no security cameras were visible. Then she simply walked away. Hours later, sitting in her car in the same parking lot, Sarah watched as the Honda's owner, a young woman who looked like a struggling graduate student, discovered the damage. The woman's face crumpled as she ran her hands along the deep scratches, clearly upset about the repair costs she couldn't afford. Sarah had the truck driver's information. A simple phone call could solve everything. But she found herself more interested in observing the woman's emotional response than in taking action to help. This behavior pattern continued over the following days. When her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, mentioned struggling with her computer, Sarah offered polite sympathy but felt no genuine urge to assist. When a homeless veteran asked for spare change outside the campus bookstore, Sarah walked past without the usual pang of guilt that seemed to affect others. During a faculty meeting where a junior colleague was unfairly criticized, Sarah remained silent, studying the power dynamics rather than speaking up for justice. Each incident confirmed what her test results had suggested. Where others felt moral obligation, empathy, or guilt, Sarah experienced only intellectual curiosity. She was like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture, fascinated by emotional responses she couldn't authentically experience herself. The revelation was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in her life, Sarah understood why she had always felt different, why her relationships remained superficial, why she could pursue research that others found too disturbing. She wasn't broken or emotionally damaged. She was simply wired differently, operating with a moral framework that prioritized logic over feeling, observation over action. But this new self-awareness brought uncomfortable questions. If she truly lacked empathy and conscience, what prevented her from crossing lines that others wouldn't dare approach? Was it only social conditioning and fear of consequences that kept her behavior within acceptable bounds? And if those external constraints were removed, what might she be capable of? The answer began to emerge during her weekly research meeting with Dr. Marcus Webb, the department head who had mentored her career. Webb was discussing budget cuts that would eliminate several graduate student positions, including Jessica Martinez's research assistantship. As he spoke, Sarah found herself calculating how she could use this situation to her advantage. "It's unfortunate," Webb was saying, "but we'll have to let Jessica go at the end of the semester." Her research on childhood trauma indicators was promising, but we simply don't have the funding. Sarah nodded sympathetically while her mind worked through the possibilities. Jessica's research was indeed promising. So promising that Sarah had been considering similar work herself. With Jessica out of the picture, Sarah could easily absorb her research direction, claiming it as a natural extension of her own studies. The university's intellectual property policies would make this perfectly legal, if ethically questionable. "I might be able to help," Sarah heard herself saying. "I could incorporate some of Jessica's work into my current projects, ensure her research doesn't go to waste." Webb smiled, clearly pleased. "That's very generous of you, Sarah. Jessica will appreciate knowing her work will continue in capable hands. As Sarah left the meeting, she realized she had just manipulated a situation to steal a student's research while appearing altruistic. The most unsettling part wasn't what she had done, but how natural it had felt. No guilt, no hesitation, just calculated opportunism disguised as kindness. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment wondering if this was how it began, not with dramatic acts of violence, but with small compromises, tiny betrayals that carved away pieces of humanity until only the calculating predator remained.
2 weeks into her self-imposed psychological experiment, Sarah began to understand the true power of her condition. What she had initially feared as a defect was revealing itself to be an extraordinary advantage. While others were paralyzed by guilt, empathy, and moral constraints, she moved through the world with crystalline clarity, unburdened by the emotional noise that clouded most people's judgment. The realization came during a departmental crisis that would have destroyed a normal person's career. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a senior researcher and Sarah's main competitor for the upcoming promotion to Associate Dean, had been conducting unauthorized experiments using university resources. Harper thought she was being subtle, but Sarah's keen observation skills had detected the irregularities weeks ago. A typical colleague might have confronted Harper directly or reported the violations through proper channels. Sarah chose a more elegant approach. She began documenting everything: altered equipment logs, suspicious material orders, irregular lab access patterns. But instead of immediately reporting Harper, Sarah waited, allowing the violations to accumulate while she built an airtight case. The opportunity to act came when Harper made a crucial mistake. During a joint research presentation to potential funding partners, Harper claimed credit for methodology that Sarah had actually developed. In that moment, watching Harper lie confidently to a room full of influential academics, Sarah felt something she rarely experienced: a cold, focused anger that had nothing to do with moral outrage and everything to do with territorial protection. After the presentation, Sarah approached Dr. Webb with her carefully compiled evidence. She presented it as a reluctant whistleblower expressing supposed anguish over having to report a respected colleague. The performance was flawless, complete with appropriate hesitation and carefully timed emotional moments that made her appear genuinely conflicted about her duty. "I've been struggling with this for weeks," Sarah told Webb, her voice perfectly modulated to convey reluctant resolve. "I hoped Elizabeth would correct these issues on her own, but after today's presentation, I can't remain silent about the ethical violations." Webb's face grew increasingly grave as he reviewed Sarah's documentation. The evidence was overwhelming and professionally presented, leaving no room for Harper to defend herself. Within 48 hours, Harper was suspended pending investigation, her research grants frozen, and her candidacy for Associate Dean withdrawn. Sarah watched Harper clear out her office with the same clinical fascination she might observe a laboratory rat navigating a maze. Harper's tears, her protestations of innocence, her desperate attempts to salvage her reputation, all of it provided valuable data about human behavior under extreme stress. Sarah even offered comfort, playing the role of supportive colleague while mentally cataloging each stage of Harper's psychological breakdown. The promotion became Sarah's by default, along with Harper's research funding and laboratory space. In a single calculated move, she had eliminated her primary competition while appearing to be an ethical whistleblower protecting the university's integrity. The elegance of it was almost artistic. But success brought new challenges. With her elevated position came increased scrutiny and responsibility. Sarah now supervised a team of 12 researchers, managed a multi-million-dollar budget, and served on committees that affected hundreds of lives. The stakes were higher, and the opportunities for exploitation were correspondingly greater. Her first major test came when reviewing grant applications for student research funding. Among the applications was a proposal from Kevin Morrison, a brilliant but socially awkward graduate student whose work on genetic markers for violent behavior could revolutionize criminal psychology. Kevin's research was groundbreaking, but his presentation skills were poor, and he had few allies in the department. Sarah saw the potential immediately. Kevin's work was so advanced that it could form the foundation for several high-impact publications, perhaps even a book that would cement Sarah's reputation as a pioneering researcher. But Kevin owned the intellectual property rights to his research methodology, making direct appropriation impossible. The solution required patience and careful manipulation. Sarah began mentoring Kevin personally, offering guidance and resources while slowly positioning herself as an essential collaborator. She introduced him to key researchers, helped refine his presentations, and gradually made herself indispensable to his work. Kevin, desperate for acceptance and professional validation, gratefully accepted her involvement. Over several months, Sarah's fingerprints appeared throughout Kevin's research. She suggested modifications to his methodology, provided access to databases, and contributed ideas that improved his results. Each contribution was carefully documented and strategically positioned to establish her claim to co-ownership of the work. The manipulation was so subtle that Kevin never realized what was happening. He genuinely believed Sarah was being generous with her time and expertise, helping him succeed out of academic altruism. Even when Sarah suggested adding her name as senior author on his publications, Kevin agreed enthusiastically, convinced that her prestige would enhance his work's reception. Sarah's colleagues praised her mentorship, noting how she had transformed a struggling student into a promising researcher. What they saw as nurturing guidance, Sarah knew to be calculated asset acquisition. She was harvesting Kevin's brilliance while appearing to support his development, ensuring that his groundbreaking discoveries would advance her career rather than his. The pattern repeated with other students and junior faculty. Sarah developed a reputation as an exceptional mentor who could identify and develop talent. In reality, she was building an intellectual empire, surrounding herself with brilliant minds whose work she could direct and ultimately claim. Late one evening, reviewing publications that bore her name but contained ideas originally conceived by others, Sarah felt a moment of crystalline self-awareness. She had become exactly what her test results predicted, a predator disguised as a protector, using her position of trust to exploit those who should have been under her care. The most chilling realization was how natural it all felt. There was no guilt, no internal conflict, no sense that she was violating some fundamental moral principle. She was simply using her abilities efficiently, operating according to a logic that prioritized results over relationships, achievement over ethics. As she locked her office and walked through the empty university corridors, Sarah wondered if this was how all monsters were made, not through dramatic moral choices, but through countless small compromises that slowly eroded the boundaries between acceptable and unthinkable behavior. The question was no longer whether she was capable of evil, but how far she would go before someone finally stopped her. 6 months into her new position as Associate Dean, Sarah had perfected the art of institutional predation. Her office, once Harper's domain, now served as the command center for an intricate web of manipulation that extended throughout the psychology department. But success had brought an unexpected problem. Someone was watching her with the same calculating attention she had once reserved for others. The realization came during a routine faculty evaluation meeting. As Sarah reviewed performance assessments with Dr. Webb, she noticed him studying her more intently than usual. His questions probed deeper than normal, focusing not just on departmental metrics, but on her decision-making processes and interpersonal relationships. "Your productivity has been remarkable," Webb said, leaning back in his chair. "The department's research output has increased by 30% since your promotion. But I've been receiving some concerns from faculty and students." Sarah's expression remained perfectly neutral, though internally she began calculating potential threats and responses. What kind of concerns? "Nothing specific," Webb replied carefully. "More like a pattern. Several people have mentioned feeling uncomfortable after interactions with you, though they can't articulate why. Dr. Chen, I've known you for 8 years, and lately you seem different, more distant, more calculating." The conversation ended cordially, but Sarah recognized the warning. Her mask was slipping, or perhaps she had simply grown too confident in her manipulations. Either way, she needed to adjust her approach before suspicions hardened into investigations. That evening, Sarah implemented damage control. She began scheduling informal coffee meetings with colleagues, carefully deploying charm and vulnerability in measured doses. She shared carefully crafted personal anecdotes, expressed appropriate concerns about work-life balance, and even manufactured a few moments of apparent emotional fragility. The performance worked beautifully. Within weeks, the whispered concerns about her coldness transformed into sympathy for a brilliant woman struggling with the pressures of leadership. Sarah had successfully redirected the narrative, turning potential weakness into perceived strength. But her success attracted unwanted attention from an unexpected source. Dr. James Crawford, a visiting researcher from Harvard studying workplace psychology, had been observing departmental dynamics as part of a broader study on academic leadership. Unlike her colleagues, Crawford wasn't fooled by Sarah's emotional theater. Their first direct interaction came during a guest lecture Crawford was delivering on manipulation tactics in professional environments. As he described how intelligent predators used institutional authority to exploit subordinates, his eyes kept finding Sarah in the audience. The specificity of his examples felt uncomfortably targeted, as if he were describing her methods with surgical precision. After the lecture, Crawford approached her with a knowing smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Fascinating research you're conducting, Dr. Chen. Your work on antisocial personality identification is groundbreaking. I'm particularly interested in your recent findings about high-functioning individuals who display these traits." "Thank you," Sarah replied, maintaining professional courtesy while internally assessing Crawford as a potential threat. "Your lecture was equally illuminating. The workplace dynamics you described were remarkably ... specific. Yes, well, when you study predatory behavior long enough, you develop a keen eye for recognizing it in the wild." Crawford's smile never wavered, but his meaning was crystal clear. Over the following weeks, Sarah became aware of Crawford's presence everywhere she went. He attended faculty meetings where she spoke, lingered near her office during student consultations, and seemed to appear wherever she was exercising her manipulative influence. His observation wasn't casual academic interest. It was focused, systematic, and deeply unsettling. The situation escalated when Crawford requested access to Sarah's research data, claiming interest in collaborative opportunities. Sarah declined politely, citing confidentiality concerns, but Crawford's response chilled her to the bone. "Of course," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "Though I should mention that I've been developing my own assessment tools for identifying antisocial traits in academic settings. The preliminary results are quite fascinating. Perhaps we could compare methodologies sometime." Sarah realized with growing alarm that Crawford suspected exactly what her test results had revealed about herself. Worse, he might be conducting his own investigation, using his expertise to build a case against her. The hunter had become the hunted, and she needed to eliminate this threat before it destroyed everything she had built. The opportunity came when Crawford made a crucial mistake. During a departmental social event, Sarah observed him drinking more than usual. His professional guard dropping as alcohol affected his judgment. She positioned herself nearby, ready to exploit any vulnerability that emerged. As the evening progressed, Crawford began speaking more freely about his research, hinting at specific individuals he was studying without naming names. But his descriptions were detailed enough that anyone paying attention could identify his subjects. Sarah recorded everything, building evidence of potential ethical violations regarding confidential research involving human subjects. The next morning, Sarah crafted a carefully worded complaint to the Visiting Scholar Oversight Committee. She expressed concern about a guest researcher who appeared to be conducting unauthorized psychological assessments of university personnel, potentially violating both ethical guidelines and privacy regulations. Her evidence was compelling, professionally presented, and devastatingly effective. Crawford's research access was suspended pending investigation. His movements on campus became restricted, and his interactions with faculty and students were monitored. The man who had been stalking Sarah found himself under institutional scrutiny, his credibility undermined by her strategic maneuvering. But Crawford wasn't finished. As security escorted him from his temporary office, he stopped at Sarah's door and delivered a parting message that haunted her for days afterward. "You're exceptional at this," he said quietly, ensuring only she could hear. Textbook antisocial manipulation executed with remarkable skill. But here's what you haven't considered. Someone who recognizes your nature isn't necessarily your enemy. Sometimes they're trying to help you understand what you're becoming before it's too late. As Crawford disappeared down the hallway, Sarah felt something she rarely experienced: genuine uncertainty. Had she just eliminated a threat, or had she destroyed the only person who understood the dangerous path she was traveling? The question gnawed at her as she contemplated her next move. The game was escalating, and Sarah was no longer certain she was winning. Crawford's departure left Sarah feeling simultaneously victorious and exposed. She had successfully eliminated a threat to her position, but his parting words echoed in her mind with disturbing persistence. For the first time since discovering her test results, Sarah began to question not just her actions, but her ultimate trajectory. The problem with recognizing one's own predatory nature was the growing awareness of where such patterns typically led. The answer came sooner than expected, triggered by an incident that would test the boundaries of her moral flexibility in ways she hadn't anticipated. Dr. Amanda Foster, a promising young researcher in Sarah's department, had developed a revolutionary therapy protocol for treating childhood trauma. Amanda's work was generating significant attention from funding agencies and pharmaceutical companies, representing potentially millions of dollars in research grants and licensing fees. Amanda was everything Sarah pretended to be: genuinely caring, ethically driven, and motivated by desire to help others rather than personal advancement. She worked with traumatized children in local hospitals, often staying late to comfort young patients whose own families had abandoned them. Her therapy protocol showed remarkable success rates, offering hope to victims who had previously been considered untreatable. Sarah recognized the opportunity immediately. Amanda's research methodology contained several innovative elements that could be extracted and repurposed for other applications. With careful manipulation, Sarah could position herself as a co-developer of the protocol, gaining access to the lucrative opportunities Amanda's breakthrough would generate. The manipulation began subtly. Sarah offered to help Amanda prepare for a major presentation to potential investors, suggesting improvements to her research documentation and presentation style. Under the guise of mentorship, Sarah inserted herself into every aspect of Amanda's work, learning the intricate details of her methodology while building a paper trail of collaboration. But Amanda wasn't as easily controlled as Kevin had been. She possessed an intuitive understanding of people that made her resistant to Sarah's influence. During one of their preparation sessions, Amanda looked up from her notes with an expression that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Dr. Chen," Amanda said carefully, "I appreciate your help, but I'm getting the feeling that you're more interested in my research than in helping me succeed. Some of your suggestions would fundamentally change the ownership structure of my work." Sarah's response was perfectly calibrated, surprised hurt mixed with professional concern. "Amanda, I'm simply trying to help you navigate the commercial aspects of your research. Academic discoveries often fail to reach the people who need them most because researchers don't understand how to work with industry partners. Amanda wasn't convinced, but she was too polite to voice her suspicions directly. Instead, she began limiting Sarah's access to her research, sharing only general information while keeping the crucial details private. The protective behavior triggered something dark and calculating in Sarah's mind. If Amanda wouldn't cooperate willingly, Sarah would need to find other ways to access her research. She began monitoring Amanda's computer usage, tracking her access to university databases, and observing her interactions with research subjects. What she discovered exceeded her expectations. Amanda had been conducting additional studies, using hospital patients without proper university oversight, a serious violation that could invalidate her entire research program. Sarah faced a choice that would define her transformation from opportunistic manipulator to something far more dangerous. She could report Amanda's violations, destroying a brilliant researcher's career and potentially harming the traumatized children who were benefiting from her therapy. Or she could use this information as leverage to force Amanda into collaboration, ensuring access to the lucrative opportunities her research represented. The decision revealed how far Sarah had traveled from anything resembling normal moral reasoning. She felt no conflict between protecting vulnerable children and advancing her own career. Amanda's welfare was simply another variable in a complex equation, no more significant than budget considerations or publication deadlines. Sarah scheduled a private meeting with Amanda, ostensibly to discuss final preparations for the investor presentation. When Amanda arrived, Sarah had prepared a comprehensive file documenting the regulatory violations, complete with patient records and institutional correspondence that painted Amanda's unauthorized research in the most damaging possible light. "Amanda," Sarah began, her tone carefully modulated to convey reluctant concern, "we need to discuss some serious issues with your research protocols. I've discovered several violations that could jeopardize not only your career, but the entire therapy program." Amanda's face went pale as Sarah methodically presented the evidence. Each document was legally obtained and accurately represented, but arranged to maximize psychological impact. Sarah watched with clinical fascination as Amanda processed the implications, career destruction, legal liability, and the end of her groundbreaking therapy program. However, Sarah continued, allowing a note of hope to enter her voice, "I believe we can resolve these issues if we work together. I'm willing to help you navigate the regulatory requirements and protect your research, but I'll need to be involved as a senior collaborator to ensure proper oversight going forward." The manipulation was masterful. Sarah had created a crisis, then positioned herself as the solution. Amanda's only choice was to accept Sarah's terms or watch her life's work disappear under institutional investigation. The young researcher's hands trembled as she signed the collaboration agreement that would give Sarah co-ownership of her revolutionary therapy protocol. As Amanda left the meeting, broken and defeated, Sarah felt a moment of crystalline clarity about what she had become. She had just destroyed an exceptional human being who had dedicated her life to helping traumatized children. and she felt nothing but satisfaction at the elegant efficiency of her manipulation. That night, alone in her office reviewing the collaboration documents that would make her wealthy and famous, Sarah finally understood Crawford's warning. She wasn't just someone who lacked empathy or moral constraints. She was actively destructive, feeding on others' achievements while wearing the mask of institutional respectability. The test hadn't just identified antisocial traits. It had revealed a predator who had learned to hunt in the civilized world, using academic credentials and professional authority as camouflage, while she systematically destroyed anyone who possessed what she wanted. The question was no longer what she was capable of doing, but whether anyone would stop her before she consumed everything valuable around her. The success of Sarah's manipulation of Amanda should have felt like victory, but instead triggered something unexpected, a growing restlessness that no amount of professional achievement could satisfy. Over the following months, as Amanda's therapy protocol generated millions in funding and Sarah basked in undeserved recognition, she found herself craving increasingly complex challenges and higher-stakes psychological games. The realization came during a university board meeting where Sarah was presenting Amanda's research as her own collaborative achievement. As she stood before the room full of distinguished academics and industry leaders, describing breakthroughs she had stolen from a woman she had psychologically destroyed, Sarah felt a familiar hunger that professional success could no longer feed. These people trusted her, respected her, hung on her every word as she explained how her innovative approach to trauma therapy would revolutionize treatment for vulnerable children. They saw her as a brilliant researcher and compassionate leader, completely blind to the predator standing before them in academic robes. The deception was so complete, so effortlessly maintained, that Sarah began to wonder what other institutions she could infiltrate and exploit. After the meeting, Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the university president, approached Sarah with an opportunity that would have been the pinnacle of most academics' careers. The National Institute of Mental Health was seeking a director for their new ethical research division, a position that would oversee psychological research standards across the country. The salary was substantial, the prestige enormous, and the power to shape national mental health policy was intoxicating. "Sarah," Hawkins said, her voice filled with genuine admiration, "your work with trauma therapy protocols and your reputation for ethical leadership make you the perfect candidate. The NIMH wants someone who understands both the scientific rigor required for breakthrough research and the moral responsibility we have to protect vulnerable populations." The irony was so perfect that Sarah had to suppress a smile. They wanted to put a predator in charge of protecting the very people she had learned to exploit most effectively. The position would give her access to research programs across the nation, influence over funding decisions that could make or break careers, and the authority to shape policies that would affect millions of vulnerable patients. But accepting the position would require leaving her carefully constructed domain at the university, abandoning the network of manipulated colleagues and stolen research that had become her hunting ground. Sarah found herself facing a choice between expanding her predatory reach or maintaining control over her current territory. The decision was complicated by an unexpected development. Jessica Martinez, the graduate student whose research Sarah had appropriated months earlier, had returned to the university after completing an internship at a private research facility. Jessica's work during her absence had been remarkable, producing insights that built on her original trauma research in ways that could revolutionize the field. More troubling, Jessica had developed a sophisticated understanding of academic politics during her time away. She was no longer the naive student Sarah had easily manipulated, but a seasoned researcher with powerful connections and a keen awareness of how intellectual property could be stolen in academic settings. Their reunion came during a departmental meeting where Sarah was presenting her latest research findings, work that incorporated methodologies Jessica had originally developed. As Sarah spoke, she noticed Jessica taking careful notes, her expression growing increasingly grim as she recognized her own innovative approaches being presented under Sarah's name. After the meeting, Jessica approached Sarah with a directness that caught her off guard. "Dr. Chen, I need to discuss some concerns about the research you presented today. Several of the methodologies you described are remarkably similar to work I developed before my internship. I have detailed documentation of my original research, including timestamps and correspondence that establish my priority." Sarah's response was immediate and calculated. "Jessica, I'm glad you're back. Your early work was indeed influential in our current research direction. However, the methodologies we're using now have evolved significantly from those preliminary concepts. Academic research is always collaborative, building on ideas from multiple sources." But Jessica was prepared for this response. "I've been advised by intellectual property attorneys during my internship. They've helped me understand how research theft typically occurs in academic settings, and the documentation I have establishes a clear pattern of appropriation. I'm not interested in destroying your career, Dr. Chen, but I need proper attribution for my work and a fair share of any commercial benefits it generates." The threat was unmistakable. Jessica had the evidence and legal backing to expose Sarah's systematic theft of student research. Worse, she had the sophistication to present her case in ways that would be impossible to dismiss or manipulate away. Sarah faced a crisis that would define her ultimate transformation. She could attempt to negotiate with Jessica, risking exposure but possibly containing the damage to her current activities. She could escalate to more aggressive forms of manipulation, using her institutional authority to destroy Jessica's credibility before she could present her evidence. Or she could eliminate Jessica as a threat entirely, using methods that went far beyond professional sabotage. The thought emerged with startling clarity and no accompanying moral revulsion. Sarah found herself calculating how easily accidents could be arranged, how convenient it would be if Jessica's evidence simply disappeared along with its creator. The progression from academic theft to contemplating physical harm felt natural, logical, almost inevitable. Late that night, Sarah sat in her office reviewing Jessica's internship records and personal information. She learned about Jessica's living situation, her daily routines, her vulnerabilities and dependencies. What had started as defensive research was becoming operational planning, though Sarah hadn't yet admitted to herself what kind of operation she was considering. The transformation was accelerating. Each successful manipulation had required greater moral flexibility. Each victory had demanded higher stakes, and each challenge had pushed her further from anything resembling normal human behavior. She was becoming something that her original test results had only hinted at. Not just someone lacking empathy and conscience, but an active predator capable of escalating to violence when her territory was threatened. As dawn approached, Sarah made a decision that would determine whether her story ended with professional disgrace or something far more terrible. The mask she had worn so carefully was finally slipping away, revealing the monster that had always been lurking beneath the surface of her civilized facade. The only question remaining was how many people would be destroyed before her true nature was finally exposed. The end came not with dramatic confrontation, but with a moment of perfect, terrifying clarity that revealed the full scope of what Sarah had become. 3 days after her encounter with Jessica, Sarah sat in her car outside Jessica's apartment building at 2 a.m, a detailed plan forming in her mind that crossed every remaining moral boundary she had unconsciously maintained. She had spent those 3 days in meticulous preparation, researching Jessica's routines with the same scientific rigor she had once applied to studying criminal psychology. Jessica lived alone on the 3rd floor of an old building with poor lighting and minimal security. She jogged alone each morning at 5:30, following a predictable route through the university's wooded research preserve. Her family lived across the country. She had few close friends, and her disappearance might go unnoticed for days. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. A staged jogging accident in the preserve, perhaps a fall from one of the wooden bridges over the creek bed. Jessica's body would eventually be found, but the evidence would suggest nothing more than a tragic mishap. Her research documentation would disappear from her apartment before anyone thought to look for it. And Sarah's career would remain secure. As she sat in the darkness, reviewing every detail of her planned escalation to murder, Sarah experienced what she would later recognize as the most important moment of her transformation. She felt no horror at contemplating Jessica's death, no revulsion at planning such calculated violence. Instead, she experienced the same cool satisfaction she had felt when destroying Harper's career or manipulating Amanda's research. This realization should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a sense of complete self-understanding that was almost liberating. She was not a broken person struggling with antisocial impulses. She was a perfectly functioning predator who had simply been operating in the wrong environment. Academic institutions had provided excellent hunting grounds for psychological manipulation, but they had also constrained her to relatively bloodless forms of destruction. The moment of decision came when Jessica's apartment lights went out, signaling her preparation for the morning jog that would never end. Sarah reached for her car keys, ready to position herself along Jessica's route and execute the plan that would silence her threat permanently. But as her hand touched the keys, Sarah's phone buzzed with an unexpected message. Dr. Crawford. The Harvard researcher she had driven from campus months earlier had sent a single line of text. The test results were never about identifying evil. They were about recognizing the choice. The message included a link to Crawford's latest research publication, released just hours earlier. The paper detailed his findings about high-functioning antisocial personalities in academic settings, presenting case studies of individuals who had used their positions to systematically exploit colleagues and students. The research was groundbreaking, but what caught Sarah's attention was Crawford's conclusion. The most dangerous assumption, Crawford had written, is that individuals who score positively for antisocial traits are inevitably destined to become predators. Our research suggests that awareness of these tendencies, combined with appropriate interventions and accountability structures, can redirect destructive impulses toward productive outcomes. The tragedy is not that these individuals exist, but that we fail to help them recognize the choice they face before crossing irreversible boundaries. Sarah read the paper 3 times, sitting in her car as dawn approached, and Jessica prepared for her fatal morning run. For the first time in months, she began to understand what Crawford had been trying to tell her. The test results hadn't revealed her destiny. They had revealed her potential. Everything that had happened since then, every manipulation and betrayal and calculated cruelty, had been choices she had made rather than inevitable expressions of her nature. The recognition came with stunning clarity. She could kill Jessica this morning, probably without ever being caught or punished. She had the intelligence, the planning skills, and the complete absence of moral restraint necessary to commit perfect murder. But she could also choose not to, could recognize that her escalating pattern of destruction would ultimately consume everything valuable in her life, including herself. As Jessica emerged from her apartment building in running gear, Sarah faced the defining moment of her transformation. The predator she had become whispered that eliminating threats was simply logical survival, that Jessica's death would solve her problems and allow her to continue building her empire of stolen achievements. But another voice, quieter but increasingly insistent, suggested that her real problem wasn't external threats, but the monster she was choosing to become. Sarah turned off her car engine and stepped out into the morning air. She called out to Jessica, who stopped with obvious nervousness at being approached by her former mentor in such an unexpected location and time. "Jessica," Sarah said, her voice carrying none of its usual calculated manipulation, "I need to tell you something important. You're right about your research. I've been systematically stealing work from students and colleagues for years, and I've become something I never intended to be." The confession continued for 20 minutes, with Sarah detailing not just the theft of Jessica's work, but the entire pattern of manipulation and exploitation she had developed. She spoke without attempting to justify her actions or minimize their impact, simply acknowledging the reality of what she had done and what she had been prepared to do. Jessica listened with growing amazement, not just at the scope of Sarah's admissions, but at the transformation she was witnessing. This wasn't the coldly calculating predator who had stolen her research, but a human being recognizing the choice between escalating destruction and something resembling redemption. The conversation ended with Sarah's resignation letter. submitted that morning to Dr. Webb, along with detailed documentation of her violations and a recommendation that Jessica be given full credit for her appropriated research. Sarah also contacted Amanda, offering to publicly acknowledge her theft of the trauma therapy protocol and ensure Amanda received proper recognition and compensation. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. Sarah's career ended in disgrace, her reputation destroyed, her stolen achievements redistributed to their rightful creators. She faced legal consequences, professional sanctions, and the complete collapse of the identity she had built through years of calculated predation. But as she cleaned out her office for the final time, Sarah experienced something she hadn't felt since taking that first test: genuine human emotion. The shame and regret were painful, but they were also authentic responses that connected her to the moral framework she had abandoned. She was no longer the hollow predator who had contemplated murder without revulsion, but a damaged person beginning to understand the choice between destruction and healing. The test had been right about her potential for evil, but Crawford had been right about something more important: the capacity for choice that separated temporary monsters from permanent ones. What happened next would determine whether Sarah's story ended with destruction or the far more difficult path toward becoming human again. If this story moved you, changed how you think about human nature, or made you question the thin line between good and evil we all walk every day, I need you to do something for me. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more psychological thrillers that explore the darkest corners of human behavior. And comment below. Have you ever taken a test that revealed something about yourself you weren't prepared to face? Your story might be the next one that needs to be told. The choice, as always, is yours.